Hello and welcome to the video for Module 1. We're going to begin our study of family violence by talking about history, even going back into ancient history briefly to talk about the origins of family violence. And then we're going to discuss some modern day theories that are used to explain family violence. The world's oldest tools were discovered in Kenya in 2015. You can see here a very ancient tool. It looks almost like a pointy spearhead that was carved out of rock. Over 1 million years ago, during the Stone Age, ancient humans carved animal bones and rocks into crude tools. The tools were used to kill animals for food and were also used to make protective coverings and shelter. But we also know that these very early tools and sharp implements were also used as weapons from one human being against another. In 2019, a large grave was discovered in Poland. The bones discovered there are estimated to be over 5,000 years old, and they were subjected to genetic testing, which proved they were all members of the same family. So what did they die of? Did they die because they were stampeded by animals or to disease or starvation? No, actually what they discovered through testing is every one of these family members died of intentional, blunt force trauma to the head. All of these people were murdered by other human beings. In ancient Egypt, it was common for children to be physically beaten by either of their parents. Household servants and certainly slaves were often whipped or tortured for the slightest infraction. And how do we know this? Well, because it's documented in their art and in their paintings. Ancient Egyptian paintings, like the one pictured here, document that the use of physical violence was routine. In the Middle Ages, mutilation and torture were common punishments for the slightest offense. You may have heard of stories where people had their hand chopped off if they were accused of stealing something, or they were intentionally blinded and lost one or both eyes because they were spying on someone or doing something else with their eyes that was considered intrusive. Have you ever heard the expression, a man's home is his castle? Well, imagine a man in his castle in this times, and he had absolute power over everything that occurred in and around that home and on that property. Men ruled their homes absolutely and could use physical violence with no consequence against anyone on that property. This expression from early England, a man's home is his castle, summarizes the role of men in a patriarchal social system. We're going to touch back again on that topic in a minute. Rule of thumb. You may have heard the expression rule of thumb. People think it comes from the Bible, but that's actually not where the expression rule of thumb comes from. The expression is derived from the English common law. In 18th century England, the law stated a man could hit his wife with any reasonable instrument, any instrument that was considered reasonable in size. So the rule of thumb stated that a husband was allowed to beat his wife with a stick, provided the stick was no thicker than his thumb. So imagine that. A man beating his wife was not only socially acceptable, it was actually written in law. It was written in law that it was acceptable for a man to hit his wife with any reasonable instrument, and that included a stick, provided the stick was no thicker than his thumb. Many of the Europeans who came to this country in the colonial era had strict religious practices. We all remember learning about, for example, the Puritans when we were in elementary school. Well, although some of these people had very strict religious practices, they were often capable of incredible violence. The genocide of indigenous people in North America in the name of westward expansion and the acquisition of territory is evidence of widespread murder and violence that occurred in the earliest formation of what we think of now as the United States. The people of the United States also enslaved and tortured countless African people, people from other regions, and their descendants for hundreds of years. So the history of the U.S. is rife with violence. Well, why does it matter? Why are we discussing this ancient and quite old history? It's because I suggest to you when people say, Today, things are so violent today, and people are so violent today. It wasn't like this in the olden days. The olden days was more peaceful. People didn't get murdered in the street in the olden days. And I would say to you, that is absolutely incorrect. We have physical evidence, proven evidence of acts of violence going back 5,000 years. People murdering and killing one another with tools and ancient stone objects. And that violent history has followed us through quite consistently to today's times. So I would argue that violence and family violence and violence against spouses and children is in fact nothing new. We've been dealing with this since the beginning of human beings and definitely throughout all of the history of the United States. But consider this. Look at this photo here. What does this show? It shows you a really serious car accident that happened in an intersection. You can see there's several cars involved, and there's actually like a large minivan or transport van on top of that pickup truck, and people are trapped underneath it. And what you see here is not police officers or firefighters who've responded to this scene, but just people who were driving past, who stopped and ran to help. And you can see these people, they don't have any tools here. They're just using their body, their hands, and what strength they have to hold this vehicle up off another human so that person can be pulled out from underneath. That's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. This vehicle could fall on any of these people and not only seriously hurt them, but even kill them. But they're all doing it. All of these people gathered together spontaneously with no training to try to lift this vehicle off another human being. Why? Well, because they care about a perfect stranger. So how do we explain this? How do we explain that people are capable of acts of extreme violence and even murder against one another, and those same human beings are capable of extreme acts of bravery and will even risk their life to try to save a perfect stranger? How do we reconcile that? Why do people harm or commit acts of violence against people they're closest to? Well, we're going to find out through this lecture and through this semester. There's an awful lot of theories to explain why human beings are violent against one another. And of course, we're going to focus on people who know each other. Professionals in many fields have used their insight, research, data, experience to explain family violence. These fields include psychologists, sociologists, biologists, anthropologists, and many other fields have come up with theories to explain why violence occurs between family members. We're going to talk about a few of them. Here's a list of some: psychopathology, substance abuse, social learning, the exchange theory, frustration aggression theory, social conflict, ecological theory, which is closely related to evolutionary theory, the culture of violence theory, violence in the media, patriarchy theory, general systems theory, social conflict, and resource. It's an awful lot of theories from all different fields, and we're going to focus on just a few of them. Starting with psychopathology. Psychopathology theory states that mental illness, personality disorders, and other psychological dysfunctions cause people to act violently toward their family members. So if someone's suffering from an extreme psychological disturbance, say for example paranoid schizophrenia, that psychological disturbance can lead to them acting violently toward other people in the family. Of course, this is not to say that everyone who has a mental health issue is violent. We're certainly not saying that. Mental health issues may be a factor for some people who act violently. The underlying theory is that some mental illnesses, personality disorders, and other psychological dysfunctions can cause people to act violently toward other family members. Substance abuse theory. We're going to talk about substance abuse quite a lot this semester. The theory here is that the abuse of drugs and/or alcohol causes or contributes to family violence. Why? Because substance abuse impairs judgment and lowers inhibition. You yourself might have had an experience or witnessed a family member or friend under the influence of a drug or alcohol use doing something that they would never normally do, acting very out of character for themselves. That's because the use of drugs and alcohol lowers our inhibition and impairs our ability to make good judgments. That's why people do dumb things while they're impaired by drugs or alcohol. But people can also act violently under the influence of drugs or alcohol, especially if that abuse is frequent and long-term. The most widely abused substance in the U.S. today is, what is it? Do you have a guess? Maybe you guess opioids, including fentanyl, Oxycontin, those sorts of drugs that have been in the media a lot lately. Maybe you guess something like methamphetamine that's often linked to acts of violence. How about marijuana, weed, and cannabis products? Somewhat recently decriminalized in New York State. You think it's the use of marijuana is the most common? If you guessed any of those, you would be wrong. But if you guessed alcohol, you would be 100% right. The most widely abused substance in the United States today is alcohol. Of course, we're not suggesting that everyone with a substance abuse problem acts violently. Certainly, there's people who suffer from various addictions who are not violent toward other family members. However, substance abuse is definitely a factor in many cases of family violence. We will see that throughout this semester, that there is a very strong link between substance abuse and family violence. That includes family violence committed by an addicted adult against another adult, and against children, and against the elderly. Social learning theory. I want you to just see this picture. I know it's kind of an animated cartoon, but it really illustrates what we're talking about here. And what you see here is a man and a woman screaming at each other. They're way too close to each other, very much in each other's personal space, pointing very aggressively toward each other's chest. And in between them is a young boy looking up and witnessing this, and he looks pretty afraid by what he's seeing. Social learning theory states that people act violently towards family members due to two things, and they're connected. The first is modeling. Modeling is just what you see here. This is a young boy witnessing his parents screaming at each other in a very violent way and pointing at each other in a very aggressive manner. That's modeling. This is, we learn what we see. We follow the examples that are set for us. So if generally speaking, the adults in our life speak to each other in a calm, rational way, that's how we're going to learn how to speak to other people. But if you grow up constantly witnessing adults screaming at each other and acting in a very aggressive way, you are going to model or demonstrate this own behavior yourself. So it's we learn what we see and what we witness. We learn from the behavior that's modeled for us. Reinforcement is that when we act this way, when we act violently, we are actually get what we want. We're rewarded, right? So for example, if a father screams at the mother and demands money, and the mother gives that money to the father, that's reinforcement. That's a reward for that behavior. So you actually get what you want by manipulating people by acting violently towards them. So modeling is we learn this behavior by witnessing it from our own caregivers and people responsible for us. And it's reinforced because when we act out violently, we get what we want, or there's some other reward for that behavior. Of course, we're not trying to suggest that everyone who's exposed to violence when they're a child grows up to be abusive themselves. That's certainly not true. However, we do know, and statistics support, many people who are exposed to violence in their homes when they're a child do become violent towards other people. So there is support for this theory that if you witness violence as a child, that can influence you to becoming abusive yourself. That's the social learning theory. The exchange theory. The exchange theory states a person commits acts of family violence because the rewards of that behavior outweigh any consequences. If a person acts violently and gets what they want and there's no negative consequences, they're going to continue to act violently. So for example, if a man is abusive toward his girlfriend and has no legal consequences for that, is not arrested, is not put in jail, is not taken to trial, is not criminally charged, if there are no social consequences, if he's able to act violently toward his girlfriend and all of his friends still like him, and all of his coworkers still like him, and he's able to maintain his job and his position in his community, and all of his family members retain relationships with him, and all of his girlfriends, friends and family maintain relationships with him, then there's literally no negative consequences for that behavior. Exchange theory also says you will continue to be violent if the person only has minor consequences. So, for example, if a woman is abusive to her husband and he leaves her for the night and comes back the next day, that's a consequence because that person did feel strongly about enough to leave overnight, but they came back the next day. So that's a very minor consequence. So exchange theory says a person commits acts of family violence because the rewards of that behavior outweigh the consequences. If a person acts violently, gets what they want, there's no negative consequences or only minor consequences, they're going to continue to act violently. However, what the exchange theory does not explain is what if a man who's violent toward his wife has extreme consequences? Say, for example, he goes to prison. Does that mean he's never going to act violently toward another spouse or to that spouse again? Well, no, we know that's not true. We know that some people suffer serious consequences for family violence, and yet they continue to be violent. So again, they're just theories. They're not perfect, and they don't explain everything for every act of violence. Anthropology and evolutionary theory are different, but similar enough for me to put them together. The field of anthropology states all human beings evolved from apes. And although we are very evolved, we still maintain most of the characteristics of our ape ancestors. It's true that human beings and apes actually share 98% of their DNA. I've also seen the statistic 94% of their DNA, but in either case, it's over 90%. Evolutionary theory states people are aggressive, violent toward children who can't reproduce or towards children who are not their biological children. This is a little interesting, right? Why would a parent be violent towards a child who cannot reproduce? Most children are incapable of reproducing, so what are they talking about there? What they're really reaching back to is the theory that when an animal is born in the wild, if that animal is not fully developed or is injured or becomes injured or is not capable of protecting itself or contributing toward the group in a meaningful way, that the animal will kill its offspring. Right? They'll kill its offspring if that offspring's not capable of protecting itself, if it's going to expose the other members of the family to predators, or that infant animal's not going to be able to grow up to be able to gain food and bring food back to the rest of the members of the family, that the parent of that animal will kill that weak offspring. That's kind of the theory, right? But it also talks about killing children who are not their biological children. The majority of abused children are mistreated by a biological parent. It's really important, so we're going to repeat that. The majority of abused children are mistreated by their own biological parent. However, not when it comes to sex abuse. The vast majority of sex abuse inflicted on children is done by a non-biological parent. So a step parent or someone who has a stranger to that child, a boyfriend or girlfriend of mom or dad, but is not someone who's biologically related to them. So physical abuse, verbal abuse, a lot of forms of abuse of children is more likely to be committed by a biological parent, with the sole exception of sexual abuse is most likely to be committed by a non-biological parent. That's not to say that biological parents never sexually abuse their children. It does happen. It's just statistically it happens less often. You're going to watch a video this week from Sadhguru, who's a very interesting and popular public speaker on a number of issues. And in the interview you're going to watch, he's asked a question at the end of his talk about violence, and a member of the audience asked him, why are human beings who are capable of incredible acts of love and compassion and kindness, why they're also capable of committing acts of egregious violence against one another? And he says, while humans have evolved into being vastly intelligent and capable beings, they lack Well, I'm not going to tell you what they lack. I'm going to let you watch the video and have him tell you what these highly evolved, incredibly intelligent human beings lack. What is the thing they lack that causes them to be violent towards one another? It's another theory. The culture of violence theory. There's both a former culture of violence theory, and I'm also going to broaden this out to talk about the violence we're exposed to just generally in media. The culture of violence theory says violence is an acceptable behavior in certain cultures, especially those in lower socioeconomic groups. Some of you may bristle at that, and I totally understand why. Violence is acceptable to some degree in all cultures. I think it would be hard to find a culture where there's never been an act of violence. Certainly, acts of violence are more acceptable in some cultures than other, but the culture of violence theory also suggests that violence is more common in lower socioeconomic groups. It's a theory, okay, but it's critical to recognize violence occurs in all socioeconomic groups. Some of the most egregious acts of domestic violence, including multiple homicides, happen in the fanciest, most expensive homes in the so-called greatest neighborhoods. But I'd also ask you to think about violence in the media, whether it be sports, movies, video games, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, whatever it is. Violence is a part of our daily lives, whether we want it to be or not. Whether you're looking at social media, you're just looking at the news. Like, if you just even open any news site, you're probably going to be exposed to a graphic video, even if you didn't open it, right? A lot of times those news sites just play very violent videos and you're not even trying to look at it. And certainly if you open Netflix or Hulu and you go on and look at what's being offered for new this week, new releases, you're going to be exposed to an awful lot of fictional crime, like in a drama series, but an awful lot of true crime, whether it be, a documentary or that sort of program. And even though it's true crime, if you click on the one newly released, is it going to be about a burglary or about somebody loitering or someone committing an art theft or counterfeiter money? Or is it more likely to be about a murder or serial murders, right? So we're exposed to these extreme acts of violence in our social media, in our entertainment, and even in our sports, right? Who's really shocked when a fight breaks out at a hockey game? So when we say that violence is acceptable in certain cultures, well, certainly in sports, it's very common, right? But it's also wider, more acceptable, and we're exposed to so much of it in our social media. And theory suggests we just become numb to it and it becomes more acceptable to it because we just get used to it because we're exposed to it all the time. Patriarchy theory, we touched on this a few minutes ago. The theory here is men are the dominant gender and are positions of control in certain societies and culture. And when men have all economic, occupational, physical, and social power, they will dominate over the women and children in their life, and that's inevitable. It's a theory, or maybe you've heard the expression, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the theory here. If one person is given all the power in the family, and in patriarchy theory that would be a man, that they will assert that dominance over other family members, their spouse, their partner, and children, and they will be violent towards them. Man's home is his castle. We talked about that, right? Whenever a man is given ultimate authority over all aspects of any family's life, that they will assert their dominance and often in violent ways. That is not to suggest in any way that all men are violent or abusive. We certainly do not believe all men are violent or abusive. And interesting, how does the patriarchy theory explain women who are violent against their adult partners and or their children? It doesn't explain that. And how about teenagers who shoot and kill one another? It doesn't explain that either. So the patriarchy theory is useful and it's very interesting to talk about and it has a lot of relevance to our course, but it also doesn't explain why women are violent or why teenagers are violent. Social conflict theory, just remember this ticking bomb, right? That fuse has been lit, it's burning up that cord, and once it reaches that bomb, it's going to explode. That'll help you remember this one. Social conflict theory says unacknowledged or unaddressed alienation, which is like feelings of extreme loneliness and isolation, and shame generate violence within a family. If you study at all school shootings, you will see the majority of school shootings are committed by young men, often teenagers. And when the stories come out about their backgrounds, what do we always see? That they were subjected to acts of extreme bullying, social isolation, that they were loners, they didn't feel connected to anything, they weren't involved in sports or activities that made them feel a part of life. They're often mistreated at home, physically or mentally, right? They were extremely alienated. They had a lot of shame they carried around with them every day. And this theory says that when that happens and when it goes unaddressed or untreated, it boils and it builds and it builds and it builds until it explodes into an act of violence. Now, it doesn't always mean it's an act of violence like a school shooting. It could be an act of violence like punching somebody else in the face or slapping someone, right? Or throwing something at someone, right? It doesn't always mean that it's lethal violence. But the theory here is that if you have unaddressed issues like alienation is a big one, a person feels like they're all alone in the world. They don't have anyone who has their back. They don't have anyone who cares about them. That sort of trauma and those feelings are ultimately going to build up to an explosive act of violence. Resource theory, sort of like patriarchy theory, but we're going to expand it. Resource theory says any person, doesn't have to be a man, if any person has ultimate authority over a family's resources, including like money, shelter, property, the social position of the family in the community, if there's one dominant family member, they are going to dominate that family and often resort to violence because they can. So again, it's this theory that power is corruptive, right? It corrupts us. So if you have absolute power over your family and your family members, you're ultimately going to become corrupted by that power, and it's going to lead to violence. But the reason that resource theory is different from patriarchy is resource theory includes women becoming that person in authority who abuses that authority and power and asserts their dominance with acts of violence over their partner or their children. It also could include a teenager using their power and control over a family to exert it violently over others. So it's like the patriarchy theory, same foundation, that ultimate power ultimately leads to violence, but resource theory includes women. So that's your lecture for Module 1, just a couple quick things before we shut off. If you have any questions or need help, always, please reach out to me. Send me a message. You can go into D2L and use the chat messaging tool at the top of your screen to send me a message. If I'm in the course live, I'll answer right away. If not, as soon as I'm back in the course, I will answer you. The other thing is I'm constantly checking the links in these modules, whether it's a link to a video or to a document. I'm checking them before I open your module. I check them while you're working on the module, but things can break without me knowing it, even if I'm doing a lot of checking. So if you go to open a document and it won't open, please use the chat messaging function and let me know so I can fix it for you. Likewise, if you open a video and you can hear the video but not see it, or you can see the video but not hear it, please let me know right away so I can get that link fixed for you. If you need anything at all, please let me know.